this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the podcast, I'm looking at the work of LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry. These are not the smaller Higgins Boats we see storming the Normandy beaches in Saving Private Ryan, but large beaching craft intended to transport and deliver fighting troops, typically a company of infantry or marines, to a hostile shore once a beachhead was secured. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me is Zach Morris. In When the Beaches Trembled, Zach writes about his grandfather, Stephen Ganzberger, who enlisted in the US Navy and served on LCIs during the war. Zach is also the former editor-in-chief of Elsie Item, the quarterly magazine newsletter of the USS Landing Craft Infantry National Association. Zach, thanks for joining me. We're going to be discussing your grandfather and his experiences with LCIs, but let's start with the LCI itself. These are not Higgins Boats, as I mentioned, which are the LCVP we see on Saving Private Ryan, storming the beaches of Normandy. So what were they?
So first and foremost, the LCI stands for Landing Craft Infantry. And you're right, it is not a Higgins boat. Higgins boats have grabbed a monopoly on the idea of landing craft in World War II. They were a little bit bigger. They weren't too much bigger, but they were about 159 feet long, and they were flat-bottomed amphibious assault vessels. And just a couple things to the audience, they're going to be hearing an alphabet soup of acronyms today as far as different abbreviations and things. So not to be confused, try to do the best we can, to explain each and every one of those, because those, even for seasoned Navy history vets, those are they can get very confusing. And so another thing, LCIs, they weren't given names. They didn't have cool names like the Saratoga or the Wasp. They were just given a number, slapped with a number or the stencil, and that was pretty much it. So LCIs, they were, to sum it all up, they were a flat-bottomed landing craft that were used to deliver American and Allied troops to enemy-held beaches.
But they don't have, certainly in the early days, they don't have that sort of Higgins Boat-esque sort of door that drops off the front. They have ramps that come down the side, don't they? So you do see photographs with troops running down these ramps off the side of a boat. That's an LCI.
Exactly. And that's why they couldn't carry tanks or vehicles, because they were equipped with two side ramps where, they would get a line of infantry or Marines and they would run down each of the sides of the ramps that would be lowered down there. As far as the different types of landing craft, they were all designed differently. So the amphibious forces was the branch of the Navy that was tasked with building and designing all the different ships that we needed at the beginning of World War II that could do the task of delivering troops and vehicles and all that different stuff. And no, so the LCI, they did not have a front bow ramp, at least at first. Later in the war, when they started to get, converted into gunboats and things like that, the blueprints design changed, where now they got rid of the side ramps. And similar to an LST and the Higgins boats, they would have a bow ramp that would drop. They would open big doors in front and they would drop a bow ramp, and the infantry would just run down that bow ramp. But to start out with, the LCIL, which is the Landing Craft Infantry Large, it was a landing style. And that's another thing too. So LCIs had little letters in parentheses with abbreviation to describe what type of LCI it was. So it really, especially with LCIs, it can get really confusing.
So is it a pre-war design? Where does it fit in with the timeline for amphibious vehicle sort of vehicles being developed? Because the Higgins boat's relatively late and quick in the war, isn't it, when it comes on? So is the LCI a pre-war design?
So yes, it was a pre-war design, and we have the British to thank for that, because after Dunkirk and the lessons learned there, the British realized real quickly that we need to design ships that can both deliver troops and evacuate troops if we need them to. And the blueprints started with like the LCI and the LST, and even the early LCVP Higgins boats, the LCAs, which were British. So it all kind of started with designs from the British, but they needed a lot of help. They couldn't do it on their own. So they would send a lot of requests over to the Bureau of Ships at the Navy. And that's kind of where the story of John Niedermeyer comes in. And so the two people that basically kicked off the amphibious force's biggest contributors, obviously Andrew Jackson Higgins, that the Higgins boat is named after, but another guy that doesn't really get a lot of credit, John C. Niedermeyer. He had a big hand in developing the LST and the LCI. And so, yes, it was a pre-war blueprint, but the Americans came in and really helped it. They added troop quarters and places to sleep. They added kitchen, a bathroom, things like that the British just didn't have. The British just basically had benches and places to come on and get off. There wasn't really much to it from the British design. So that's why they needed some extra help. And they did, especially Winston Churchill. He was a big fan of the LSTs. He had a big hand in that, personally overseeing that process, because it really was the British and the lessons learned at Dunkirk that really kicked off the amphibious forces in the very beginning of World War II. How
self-contained are these? Because, it's nearly 160 feet long. So it's quite big. It can hold, up to 200 troops? Something like that. It's big. So these must be ocean going, presumably. So they must be basically small ships. I should have looked up to see how big a Corvette was. Where's it? It must be creeping up to that sort of size, other than it's flat bottomed.
Well, yeah, you hit it right on the head as far as, ocean going. They were the smallest ocean going vessel that was allowed to be a commissioned vessel crossing the ocean on its own. Anything smaller like LCTs, LCMs, little Higgins boats, they weren't commissioned vessels where they could cross the ocean on their own. LCIs were the smallest little one. And in my opinion, it's incredible. They more of them didn't sink on the way over there. I can't believe that they all basically made it, like crossing the giant Pacific Ocean. The way that these flat bottoms, that's another thing about ship design, is they weren't displacement hulls like destroyers that slice smoothly through the water. They had flat bottoms. They were like a cork on the water. They would feel every wave, even in calm waters. So a seasickness plagued them. Every single one of them that had the LCI experience because of the flat bottom. So yeah, they could cross the ocean, but it's funny because original plans, they weren't meant to cross the ocean. When they first drafted up LCIs, they were supposed to ship them over into their theater of war in parts and then assemble them over there. But because of the urgency of wartime, they were like, we can't do that. That's not tenable. So they put them together and they crossed the ocean somehow all on their own.
Well, presumably, if you're thinking invasion of Europe, that's much more feasible to do with them. You ship them to England. We have, the British have the infrastructure to put them together, and it's a short hop across the channel. And then you start thinking of the Pacific, and you start to think, well, it's a tremendous use of resources having to move ships when we've already got everything else to move. Why don't we just stick them together and see if they can bob their way over on their own?
What a trial and error process that must have been. Especially these early design LCIs, they weren't very aerodynamic. As far as like wind resistance, they had like a square conning tower. So when the wind hit it, it would like push it off and misdirect it. There was a lot of problems with the design early on. Slowly but surely, they did improve the design a little bit as the war went on, and it wasn't as bad.
Is there a specific branch of the Navy that ran the LCIs, or are they just sort of lumped in as part of the fleet kind of thing? Because they've kind of got to fit a land and sea role, moving troops and Marines. So how does the command structure work for them?
So they were all of them. Every craft and landing ship that was designed to land troops, they kind of segmented them off in their own branch of the Navy called the amphibious forces. They had a special patch for it and everything to indicate that you were in the amphibious forces of the Navy. And that was all the different ships, like I said, that were tasked with crashing onto land, because that's one thing with the Navy. Ask any Naval Academy person. You could get court-martialed and kicked out of the Navy. That could kill your career if you crash your ship onto land, if you broach your ship. So the very fact that these ships were invented to crash into land, like nobody wanted to be part of the amphibious forces in World War II. So some of the vessels were commissioned, some of them weren't. Like LCMs, LCVPs, they were just basically carried on LSTs. But then other ships like, landing ship tanks, the biggest ship in the amphibious forces, them and LCIs, they would tend to have a little bit more of a larger responsibility. But yeah, so they were part of the amphibious forces, and they were brand new in World War II.
Do they have their own, I guess there'd be flotillas, won't they, rather than fleets? Will they all operate it as?
Yeah. And I'm sorry. So to touch on your chain of command question, so the amphibious forces was kind of grouped in with each and every fleet. So the 7th Fleet, MacArthur, for example, they would have the 7th Amphibious Forces attached to the 7th Fleet. And men like Daniel E. Barbie would be, Richard Kelly Turner, they would be in charge of like the amphibious forces of that part of the fleet. And so, but they would, they were integrated with the rest of the Navy. So they were just as important piece of the puzzle as like battleships and aircraft carriers. The LCIs were the ones when the kamikazes came along to protect the big ships like battleships with smoke screens. They would have a Besler fog machine. They would light it up and blow smoke and try to hide and mask the carrier. So they even though they're brand new and they did the job no one else wanted to do, they became a critical part of the fleet that were much needed.
The other thing I think we need to tease out is they build a tremendous amount of them, don't they?
They did. So there were over 900 of these LCIs built between, I believe it was 1942 and 1944, 1945. There was almost 1,000 of them, and almost 1,000 of LSTs, and every other different types of vessel that was made. Many, many more of LCVPs and Higgins boats. But it just goes to show you that, I mean, these were relatively larger too. So it took, a lot of these ships like a week to get made. So it was not an easy process to put these things together.
My assumption is, I might be wrong, that the Higgins boats being wood, possibly more disposable, so you would make, and I guess they're doing the initial sort of landing, so they would be cheaper and faster to build, whereas these are quite a substantial piece of kit, and 1,000 of them is a lot of them. Carrying 200 men a boat is a lot of capacity.
Oh, and there's all sorts of things that you have to factor in now with commissioned vessels, like kitchens and, places to sleep and bathrooms. You don't got to worry about that on a little Higgins boat. They just basically man the guns, have someone, a coxswain, to drive it, and that's basically it. Get into the beach and get back to the ship. That's basically the job. But, when it comes to building ships that men are going to live on, there's a whole lot more, and it gets even more expensive.
So were they organized with a mothership that they would stock up from, or they would, I don't know, for their parts, their food, their water, their fuel? Was there a sort of a mothership base that they would go back to and from?
Not really. They were on their own, and you hit on a big part of why it was such a struggle to basically be a crewman on an LCI, is because you fended for yourself. They depended on the larger ships to get them supplies, but a lot of times they couldn't get their supplies, whether it was getting an attitude at the supply people who were running the depot, or just these battleships or cruisers or what have you didn't want to give up their supplies, or they didn't have spares to give. Everything from food to water to fuel. I mean, they would have to travel in convoys across the ocean, obviously, for fuel. But other than that, no, they were basically on their own. They would sometimes travel in little groups, but it was very, very difficult to get supplies. And you ask any LCI vet from World War II, that's one of the biggest struggles that they talk about is just getting the supplies that they needed, that just basic living, because they didn't have any of the necessities in life. They didn't have freshwater showers. They didn't have laundry facilities. Bathroom was basically a slat of wood with a hole in it, with a pipe running underneath. So it's like, it's just really draconian living. It doesn't get much more harder than that.
And presumably from their, whoever's in charge of them is so low down the food chain, he doesn't have a lot of clout to actually order supplies and march around shouting at people in supply depots to requisition things.
Exactly. And I know I touched on it earlier. It was really hard for them to get supplies because they were seen as expendable. Like, nobody cared about the amphibious forces. You guys don't matter. You don't need this as much as like the battleship needs this. So it was like, yeah, they ran into that problem. They didn't get any respect. They really didn't. They were looked at as second rate.
It's slightly flippant, but did they have their own ice cream machine like everything else in the US Navy?
They did not. Oh, there's a couple entertaining stories about how some of the guys from the LCI would go over to the bigger ships for whatever reason, and they bring back ice cream and would just make everybody else jealous.
I thought that was a prerequisite of the American Navy, that every vessel had an ice cream machine.
It should be the rule. That should have been the rule.
just too small for it. So we're going to be looking at your grandfather, Stephen. Is it Ganzberger? Was he drafted or did he enlist into the US Navy?
So he enlisted. So when Pearl Harbor happened, he just turned 17. And at the time, you needed your parents' permission if you wanted to enlist at 17. And his parents had a rule. He couldn't enlist until you were 18. So he had to wait until August of 42. And he enlisted the day after his 18th birthday. So he enlisted in the Navy for the same reason usually everyone from that time enlisted in the Navy. They didn't want to sleep in the dirt. They didn't want to sleep in a foxhole, have a dry bed every night. So that was one of the reasons that factored into it. But yeah, no, so he wasn't drafted, he enlisted.
Did he have any choice in where he was posted, or was he happy to just be put on LCIs?
None whatsoever, had no say in that. It was just destiny. He just happened to get fated to get assigned to an LCI, and that was that. And I'm sure, like everybody else, put in requests to try to transfer and get off there as soon as possible. But, those were met with just as much disregard as, trying to get off and get out of the amphibious forces. Because once you were there, you're basically stuck.
Oh, what I should have asked to start with is, where was he from? Was he from a naval part of the US? I mean, is he even aware of, how the Navy functioned?
So he was originally from Michigan, from Wyandotte, Michigan. So he didn't have to go far when he enlisted, because everybody who enlisted in the Navy for boot camp in America at the time, they went to Great Lakes, Illinois. which is a hop, skip, and a jump away from where he was at in Wyandotte. So it wasn't too long of a train ride.
Was he posted to his LCI in the US, or was he posted in theatre because he's in the Pacific, isn't he?
So he was assigned to an LCI virtually right away. So as soon as they left Great Lakes, Illinois, they went over to Norfolk, Virginia, where the Little Creek base is, that's where America's like amphibious training base is in Virginia there. And so they did some training there, get used to the craft. And then they were assigned their LCI 329, his first ship, the LCI 329. That was in Galveston, Texas, because it was built in Houston. That's where most of the LCIs in Flotilla 5 were built, is in Texas there, in Houston and down south there. And again, flotillas are just groups of ships. LCIs were basically assigned to flotillas, and that's how they traveled together, and they were basically built and conducted drills together.
Yeah, that's obviously the wrong coast to go to the Pacific.
You hit on another really good point, Angus. You really did. So they had to cross through the Panama Canal, and that was a whole adventure too. The first few weeks getting used to the ship, once they were commissioned, they would do these things called shakedown cruise, just basically just kind of testing out the ship, make sure it functions correctly, and make sure nothing breaks down. Get the crew their sea legs, if you will, kind of get them used to that. And then once the shakedown cruise is over, that was it. They were assigned to their theater of war. And, I don't think anybody in Flotilla 5 had any say where they were going. They were basically assigned to the Pacific right away.
How long does it take? I'm not sure what speed they move at. How long does it take them to get through from the sort of the East Coast through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific Ocean to wherever they needed to be?
Oh, gosh, I think it took them maybe a week or so to get from, the Gulf of Mexico there down to Panama. I believe they stopped in Honduras, too, on the way down there to get supplies. Obviously, they didn't run out right away. They were a small ship. But then once they crossed the canal, as far as how long it would take in a straight shot, I'm not sure. So they could go at about 14 knots. It took them about 2 or 3 months to get from Panama to all the way to the Solomon Islands where the front lines were. But they stopped for like a month in New Caledonia. So, they stopped off at like Polynesia. They stopped off at, the Samoa, Fiji, New Caledonia. So they kind of said because they had to resupply and everything, but it took them a long time because they had to, also conduct drills and things like that at the islands they were at to get them ready. So it was a very, very long trip across the Pacific.
I think I'm saying his first action is Operation Toenail. Now, you might want to remind us what that is, but was that an assault landing they were doing, putting troops onto the beach? So
Operation Toenail refers to the New Georgia campaign. In early 1943, after the Marine Corps had secured Guadalcanal, it was basically, okay, what do we do next? Now what? And the strategy for Operation Cartwheel, which was basically MacArthur's overall island hopping strategy, is they wanted to surround and neutralize Rabaul that was on New Britain. And so after Guadalcanal, they had a host of other islands they had to basically island hop and invade before they could get close enough to Rabaul. And so Operation Toenail was the New Georgia campaign, and that was his first campaign. And that was actually the first campaign that LCIs were in, period. The very, very first one, that was their big debut, was the New Georgia campaign. And so the New Georgia islands are broken up into several different islands. There's New Georgia proper, which is the biggest one. But then there's also a small island called Rendova, which is right across to the south of the main New Georgia proper island. And that's where Flotilla 5 conducted their very, very first landing on the northern coast of Rendova there. And that was their first combat, was on July 4th of 1943. Big LCI debut, and they all landed as a flotilla together for the first time. They were attacked by 16 Japanese bombers. They carpet bombed the LCIs there. My grandpa, Stephen Ganzberger, was credited with shooting down one of them on the number 2 gun on the LCI 329, but there were, I think 14 out of 16 of them got shot down by guns in the harbor there. They just lit them up. And then the other 2, I believe, they got taken out by American fighters that chased them down. But that was their first action there in Operation Toenails. And so that was the first of 7 campaigns that he would end up seeing combat in.
Were they prepared for aerial attack? We're not sure what they were armed with.
So LCIs in the very beginning, it was pretty standard. They got 4 20 millimeter or like an anti-aircraft guns. And so that could do surface. You could shoot targets on land and on ships and barges and things like that. But mostly the 20 millimeters were equipped for anti-aircraft. And they did a pretty good job. And at the end of the day, even when they got larger guns like 40 millimeters and 3-inch 75 millimeters, still at the end of the day to go to that was the most effective, at least from what I've heard from vets, from LCS, was the 20 millimeter. And they had 4. So they had one in the very front at the bow of the ship. They had one right behind the conning tower atop the deck house in the middle of the ship. And then they had two side by side right on the back at the stern of the ship. So they were equipped with 420 millimeters.
So on that landing, are they going into was it a hostile beach that they were landing troops on, or had the beach already been secured?
So it was considered a hostile beach, but they had landed, I want to say 5 days before that on June 30th. And so that would have been the first wave invasion considered of Rendova. So by the end of that, they pretty much cleared the beach. That was safe. But still, at that point in the war, the Japanese were still close by with all their planes and their best pilots, and they would send them almost every day to bomb the forces there on Guadalcanal and New Georgia.
So from their point of view, the biggest threat's either the Imperial Japanese Navy turning up, which you would hope the Navy boys would look after before they got to you, or aircraft, of which you could fall back on your own air defences.
In general, yes. However, at Rendova, there was something very unique about that particular battle that you really didn't see too much else. Maybe Guadalcanal, but Rendova was famous, and the New Georgia campaign was famous for Japanese snipers hiding in trees. And so that was another reason why gunboats became necessary in pre-invasion bombardment, is to shoot the treetops, because they realized that they could really disguise themselves up in the trees. And sometimes they'd wait for the ground forces. They would think it was secure, and then they'd go and they'd advance. And then all of a sudden, snipers from the trees are hitting them from behind. So it was really challenging. So even though you're right, technically the beach was considered secure, the island wasn't secure at all.
You've alluded to this before, but they start converting the LCIs. This includes the one your grandfather was on, doesn't it? And they convert them into gunboats. Why are they doing that? What role are they fulfilling? And how do they operate? Are they still putting people on the beaches, or are they doing something completely different now?
So yes and no. So this is where we get a huge divergence in the story of LCIs. And ever since writing the book, I've kind of come to call it like a tale of two eras. The LCI, really, the lifespan of an LCI is split into two major eras. One at the beginning of the war, which is what we talked about and touched on, is the landing craft. They were primarily designed as a landing craft. However, slowly but surely, they were converted into gunboats and much, much heavier armed, bigger guns placed on the ships. So what they would do is some of the LCIs, like my grandpa's, his second ship, the LCI 65, they took the ramps off to make room for the heavier guns. Now, why did they do that? If I had to tie it down to one main reason, it was probably the lessons that were learned at the Battle of Tarawa. Now, for those who've never heard of the Battle of Tarawa, that was one that happened in November of 1943. It was a slaughter for the Marines, because one of the main reasons was because they didn't have enough troop protection going into the beach. The Amtraks made it over the reef just fine, but some of those Higgins boats that weren't tracked, they would get caught up on the reef, so they would have to drop the ramp very far out. And Tarawa was unique because it was very hostile. It was a very well reinforced beach by the Japanese. So anybody out there on the reef that was trying to make their way to the beach in like chest high water, they were basically gunned down. Now, why was it so bad? Well, because what happened in invasions in general, and this is just now speaking in general, is there was something called the lull period, where it meant that the bigger ships that stood farther off land, they would fire, their big shells at the island to try to kill targets, to try to kill Japanese. But what would happen is they would have to stop as soon as the American forces started to get closer to the beach, because they couldn't afford hitting their own guys. They had to stop at some point. And that short amount of time that they stopped firing, up until the point that the Marines or the troops actually landed, there was no fire coming. There was no troop protection for our guys. They were basically just landing. And that lull period caused the Japanese to basically be able to rearm, reposition their guns, adapt real quickly, see where the Marines or the infantry are coming ashore, and then reposition their guns. Now, because they didn't have that troop protection, like I said, it was a slaughter at Tarawa. So basically what they said is the Navy had to come up with a way, like, how can we provide more troop protection up till the moment that they land? And LCIs became the answer, because LCIs already, they were seaworthy. They could cross the ocean. They know that they could crash onto the beach, so they knew they could get close enough to land. So they already have an ocean going vessel. And what they did was basically, why did they convert them to gunboats? They basically turned these things into floating tanks. And so they armed them like tanks, and they armed them like super tanks. Because if you look at like an M4 Sherman tank, it has a 75 millimeter, it has a couple other guns here and there. That's basically it. It's that 75 millimeter cannon that everyone notices that does the most damage. They put one of those, a 3-inch 50 caliber, which is a 75 millimeter, they put one of those on an LCI, but then they also said, you know what, we're not done yet. Let's put a 40 millimeter on there. Let's move the 20s and keep our 420 millimeters. Let's put another couple, 50 cals on here. So we have 650 cals. So in the end, these little tiny ships that are like 150 feet long are like super tanks that are just all guys and guns. And what was crazy about these conversions of LCIs is they went even further. So they're like, okay, well, that's great. Now we have these super tanks. Well, now let's turn these into little bazooka boats too, where like they not only have these super tank capabilities on each side, they got rid of the ramps, like we said earlier, and they put rocket launcher racks in there. And so think of the damage that one bazooka does. That's like the end of the climax of a movie. The guy comes in with the bazooka, blows up the building, it's over. Like that, that's it. Now imagine hundreds of bazookas going off at the same time, right next to these Higgins boats as they're coming in, just less than 100 feet from the beach. And, these guys are firing these heavy guns. They're shooting off bazookas. Some of them, they have mortars that are lobbing over at the Japanese as they're coming in. And they can go in there as the troops are landing and still be firing as the bow ramps are going down in these Higgins boats. So it was a great idea what they did with LCIs in converting them. And that's, I say 2 eras because that basically closed the door. And even though later in the war, they still had the large class landing craft LCIs to deliver troops, the primary job became gunboats and bazooka boats and rocket ships as they learned how effective they were.
It's a testament to how well designed that original platform is of a ship to be able to convert it as well, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And if you don't mind, Angus, I have to, because like I said earlier, before we started recording, huge fan of the podcast. If I may, you had a guest on, Christopher Camfield, and you guys were talking about the Archer, the anti-tank gun. And it was funny because all these individuals and chains of command in the Navy, they were thinking to themselves, how can we develop a floating tank? How can we make tanks float? And it was almost that they were and it reminded me in your podcast with them, it was all these, they're trying to, Hobart's funnies. They're trying to, Percy Hobart and the British, they were trying to design these special floating tanks when really they were asking themselves the wrong question. It wasn't, how can we make a tank float? It was, what can we take that already floats and make it a tank? And that's basically what they did with LCIs. And I thought that conversation was so interesting because every time I hear about tanks and things like that, it's like, they solved it. The Navy already had the solution the whole time. And I always laugh at that when I think about that.
But it's quicker than going back to the drawing board and having to do the perfect thing. We've got something, it works, let's just change it. But when they're doing these conversions, do they then have to spend months moving the ships back to US shipyards, do the conversions, and then sail all the way back again?
For a lot of them, yeah. But what happened is, for example, my grandpa, they had already established some bases early on in the war, kind of deeper close to Australia. And so one of them was New Caledonia. One of them was the New Hebrides Islands. My grandpa on the LCI 65, he went to, I believe it was the New Hebrides Islands. So they kind of backtracked a little bit, and some did go home to San Francisco to get converted. Some went to Hawaii to get converted. But my grandpa went down to the New Hebrides Islands, and that's where the LCI 65 was converted from an LCI-L to an LCI-G, which, again, with abbreviations, landing a large class landing, and went from LCI-L to an LCI-G, which means gunboat, which stands for gunboat.
So do they have to then change all the crews around as well? Because you said you've got a whole different raft of specialists, or do they just get more gunners on and the original crews just stay?
You got it. So original crews stay. I mean, sometimes there was some moving around of people given expertise in their certain jobs if a ship needed a certain type of guy. But for the most part, no, they kept their entire crew, and then they would just add new guys because that's a great point that you bring up. As they put on these huge guns, they needed more guys as part of the crew to operate these guns. They were no longer troop compartments. They were now extra compartments for the crew to sleep in because they needed these extra guys to fire these guns.
So in LCI 65, Stephen takes part in the landings at Leyte in the Philippines, doesn't he? What are they doing? Is this dangerous for them now as a gunboat?
Oh, it's among the most dangerous jobs of all because they're now in the first waves. Whereas LCIs before weren't necessarily first waves, maybe second, third wave. The gunboats were not only first wave. Basically, you could consider it ahead of the first wave, the pre-first wave, because they're the ones that have to basically go side by side with the Higgins boats. And at the last minute, they would do like a 9 turn to the side and start moving parallel to the beach. And that's so that all their guns could fire on the beach. And yeah, it was extremely dangerous. My grandpa on the 65 got very lucky because the initial bombardment at Leyte Island, Philippines on October 20th, MacArthur's famous return, they went in with a whole flotilla of LCIs to bombard the beach. And, 3 or 4 of them got hit by, heavy Japanese artillery right next to him. So if, it would have just went run more over, it would have hit his ship, but he got really lucky. Like, I think it was the 71, the 72, the 73, they all got hit. And he made it out of there. Very lucky. That's one thing I always reflect on, is how lucky he was to make it out, because he also got kamikaze too.
They're also there during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, aren't they? So what were the LCIs doing there? Because presumably they must have been either off like a rocket out of the way as much as possible, or trying to get themselves in the way as much as possible. But they're small compared to the Japanese fleet that arrives.
That's exactly right. And so their job, basically, when that whole battle kicked off, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, for those 4 days, they were hiding. They were doing their best to hide in Leyte Gulf, because if the Japanese center fleet would have made it in there, they would have demolished the entire amphibious forces, because they weren't equipped. I mean, yeah, they had heavy guns, but a 3-inch and a 40 and a 20 millimeter, they can't take down a battleship or a cruiser, these super battleships that the Japanese had. They couldn't, and they knew that. So during that battle, once the Leyte landing with MacArthur was basically kind of wrapped up, and they were evacuating casualties and things like that, basically their job was done. So they just were kind of waiting around and to do other things. And once the Japanese fleets started showing up, basically they were hiding.
That's when he was hit by, that's when the kamikaze got them, wasn't it?
That was when so on October 24th, 1944, they were this is now 4 days after the invasion, and they're patrolling off of Leyte, off of like White Beach near Tacloban, near that airfield. And a group of Japanese fighters came in, or I think it was a Japanese bomber that came in, and they chose the LCI that day as the LCI 65 as the target. And my grandpa's, one of his best friends, the cook on the ship, Lester Eugene Aston, he was at the number 4 20 millimeter gun, which was at the back of the LCI 65. It was on the starboard or right side if you're facing forward. So he was on that gun, and ironically enough, he was actually credited with shooting that plane down. And as it was coming down, it shot a torpedo at him that missed because of the LCI's flat bottom. The torpedo went right under there. Even though the flat bottom was unfortunate for seasickness, it saved their lives several times because the torpedoes would pass directly underneath. So this plane, it dropped a torpedo that missed, but unfortunately it crashed into the back of the ship, and it killed Lester Aston, my grandpa's friend. That was a day that he remembered more than any other day in World War II. It was really sad to lose his friend, because everybody that I talked to from the ship, or everybody that went on record about it, it's unfortunate, because Lester Aston was one of those really nice guys. He was one that everybody was just like, he was just a genuine nice guy. And it breaks your heart to imagine that it was that type of person that was the only one to lose his life that day on the ship. So and being the cook on the ship, it's the type of guy they see every day. The crew sees the cook every day for 3 times a day for a meal. So it's really painful to lose not only a friend, but it's like one of the few cooks that's on board, a guy that you're so used to seeing every day. So it was hard.
So they're not very big ships. What kind of damage does a kamikaze do to it? Terminal? It
can basically split the thing in half if it hits it right. But luck for the LCIs, that never really happened. There was some major ones, like the LCI 1065 was sunk nearby my grandpa's ship. That one, plumes of smoke going up like a mile in the air. The one that hit my grandpa's ship, the LCI 65, they weren't lucky, but they were kind of lucky at the same time, that they really just only got clipped. And so even though they just got clipped, it did so much damage and destruction to the back of the ship. But it just goes to show you that just even getting clipped by like a wing can not only be deadly and kill guys, but it's like it could destroy like the back quarter of everything that's on that ship.
So where do they get repaired then for that, when you've got a vessel that's still seaworthy and repairable? Is there repair vessels nearby to get fixed? It
depended. Basically, the answer to that is whoever is the closest nearby that's equipped to fix us, whether that's LSTs, whether those are, dry docks, whether those are another acronym for you, LSDs, landing ship docks. So those are very, very large. It acts as a dry dock where you can pull into like an opening of the ship, and then they drain the water, and you're now on dry dock on these LSDs. So a lot of times they didn't really have any other option than to tie up to an LST and jump overboard and have guys swim under the water and fix the propeller underwater. So it's like they really made do with what they had.
They went to the USS Achilles, which was actually, that was itself as a converted landing craft tank. Is that why it gets the name?
So that was an LST, a landing ship tank, correct, that was converted. That was another thing they started doing is they converted these into landing craft repair ships that were specialized. They would take LSTs, make them hospital ships, make them, landing craft repair ships. LSTs had a bunch of different roles too as the war went on, because of their big size. So the USS Achilles, they were tied up. They called it Bloody Sunday, November 11th, 1944, just a couple weeks after the initial landing. And that was one of the worst kamikaze attacks of the entire war. I mean, that rivaled Okinawa with how bad that was and just the sheer number that attacked that day. And they were tied up to an LST, a repair ship, and the kamikaze came in and just missed them and hit the LST. So they got hit by one and then had another very close call within a couple weeks. They got very lucky to miss that one.
I can't remember. Does the LST get hit? I can't remember if the Achilles got hit. It did, didn't it?
Yeah, and they lost guys. And sadly, I think one of them was named John Angle. And, they got to know some of these guys on the Achilles because that wasn't the first time the Achilles would help them. They travel in the same flotillas and, they would get nearby ships from time to time, the same one repeatedly helping them with doing welding and work. And one of the guys that came on their ship to help them weld guns and do repairs was a guy named John Angle who served on the Achilles. And unfortunately, he was one of the ones that died. And he died on, I believe it was the anniversary of him enlisting. So he'd been in the Navy for exactly 1 year and the kamikaze got him. And it was really sad because my grandpa told me a story about how there were people that were, whether they were thrown overboard or whether they jumped overboard because that kamikaze hit them, they were basically struggling in the water. There was too much chaos going on where they couldn't save them in the water. They either had to get out of there as quickly as they could or put out the fires that were raging on the Achilles, or some of them sped off to go lay smoke screens. So because there were so many kamikazes, they wanted to protect the other LSTs. So it was so chaotic that the one thing my grandpa remembers from that day is all those poor guys in the water that normally probably would have gotten picked up right away. But because of how chaotic everything was at that moment, I believe they all perished in the water.
What I was fascinated by was the fact that the LST is now a mobile repair station, but what I couldn't get my head around it is it's large enough to have 4 then LCIs, which are quite big themselves. I think it's 4, isn't it? All being worked on at the same time. You just think, wow, that's a real kind of make, do and mend mobile sort of work centre moving about. There's a lot going on there that never gets looked at. It doesn't get depicted in films or anything.
And that's one of the most saddest parts about it is there's so many incredible stories and they were so important. Like the role that the amphibious force has, we would not have won World War II without them. And I mean, you can have arguments all day as far as bombers and things like that, but most major historians will agree with you that you got to put the boots on the ground. You got to put the supplies on the ground.
So Stephen, I mean, we've touched upon 2 campaigns he was in there, aren't we? What did you say he was in? 6, 7, 6, 7?
7. Yeah. So you get a bronze service star for each combat. He had 7 stars by the end. So he had a silver and 2 bronze by the end. So he was in Rendova, New Georgia. He fought at Bougainville at the Treasury Islands. When they first start, the very, very first gunboats that ever got converted were in his flotilla group there. They tested them at the Treasury Islands there, south of Bougainville. So he was involved in the invasion of Green Islands, which is basically considered the consolidation of the Northern Solomon Islands. He was involved in the neutralization of Rabaul, basically the Bismarck Archipelago operations. And then he was at the Battle of Morotai, which was the Netherlands East Indies at the time. And then the 2 at the Philippines, Leyte Gulf and Luzon. So those were the 7 campaigns that he was credited for.
So by February 45, they've been withdrawn by then, aren't they? Is that...
Yeah. So, his war was essentially over by February of 45. I mean, he was still in the Navy over in the Pacific, but they had just gone through their last invasion at Luzon in January of 45. And at that point, they sent my grandpa home because at that point, I mean, he'd been on an LCI for 2+ years with basically no liberty. That was another thing. Those guys on LCIs, they weren't really given consideration for liberty. He had a lot of issues, and especially the PTSD that was developing with his friend dying, right in front of him. Being kamikaze, that was really hard on him. But then reading his medical file, it's like he was suffering from things from catastrophic battle dreams to anorexia because they didn't have food on these ships. They just didn't have the necessity. So it's like these guys were suffering from anorexia. So it's like, but by February of 45, they mostly were getting repairs for the massive 4-month campaign they were involved in. So they had a lot of repairs that they were doing in February and March and April of 45. But in May of 45, my grandpa eventually got sent home. the rest is history. The atomic bombs were dropped in August, and he was discharged like the very next day.
Was he that fast?
That fast. He had so many points. I mean, at that point in the war, the captain wanted him to basically re-enlist as, go to quartermaster school, but he was like, I'm done. I've had my share of the Navy and the armed forces.
I assumed even then they'd be hanging on just in case the Japanese didn't surrender. We're going to recall these guys back. Does he go back to the States and put into a training position? Is that what they moved back to?
Well, what was supposed to have happened, it's kind of funny how it worked out. He was supposed to be discharged for medical reasons, for obviously the PTSD. Back then they called it like war neurosis. They had a few different names for it, but they were in the process of giving him a medical discharge. And then the atomic bombs were dropped in August. And then basically at that point, the end of the war, the VJ Day, the victory over Japan, basically overrided and trumped everything else at that point. And then they shelved the medical thing and basically were like, you have a full discharge because the war is over. So it kind of overrided a different type of discharge. He was going to get an honorable discharge with that, but that one, basically the war's over. So, we don't need him anymore.
So what's he do with himself after the war? Does he get as far away from the sea and the Navy as he possibly could?
That's a great way to put it. That's exactly what he did. He ran and he ran and he didn't look back. So a few years later, he married my grandma and they eventually had 6 kids. With the work that he did on the LCI with sheet metal and things like that, he became a sheet metal worker. And he also became a city councilman. He was city council president in Southgate, Michigan for, I think, the late 70s, early 80s. So he did a lot for the community, helping them build, everything from the fire department to the police headquarters and various projects within the city of that. So he had a lot to be proud of, but he loved playing golf. He loved hanging out with his family. He was the best. I like to say that it might sound like I'm biased because he was my grandpa, but like he was my grandpa, but he also just so happened to be the best man that I'd ever met.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Zach Morris, and we're discussing LCIs. So what happens to if they built, getting on to 1,000 LCIs, what happens to them all after the war? Is there a civilian use they could be moved on to?
Yes, that's another very good question. So most of them were scrapped for sheet metal and parts and things like that because I didn't really need them too much. But yeah, they did. There was a lot of LSTs and LCIs that basically were sold to other countries. Some were sold to China, some were sold to Britain. Spain got a couple. I think Chile got one. So Greece took the LST 325. So they really were spread all over. Some of the LCIs, my grandpa's first LCI, the LCI 329, that was actually used in the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946 after the war. So when they did those, I think it was Operation Crossroads, where they did the A, B, and C nuclear tests. They did like 2 above water, and then they wanted to see what happens when you blow one up underwater. And I think that they blew it up under the LCI 329, and that was eventually they scrapped all those ships. But for most of them, they did come back, and there were some civilian uses. Some were fishing boats, but for the most part, they did. LCIs were scrapped for their scrap metal.
Is there any left?
There are. So there's 2 left. Both of them are on the West Coast. One of them, the LCI 1091, is in Humboldt Bay, California. But the more famous one is the LCI 713, and that's the one that's in Portland, Oregon. And both of those are LCI 351 class, meaning that they have like a round conning tower instead of like the square conning tower that my grandpa's LCI had. So it's a little different design. It's a little bigger, but nonetheless, it's a floating museum. You can go on there and tour it, and a great bunch of guys that run the museum. It's a part of history that still floats. So it's great to.
It never fails to amaze me how thousands of these certain things could be produced during wartime and then they're just scrapped. And you can't believe that there's none left. They were not seen as important. People want to get as far as possible. And now you think, oh, the horror of losing all that unique things. Now, you were the editor-in-chief of Elsie Item, which was the quarterly magazine for the USS Landing Craft Infantry National Association. Now, what I was going to ask, my final question was, how do these crewmen, that you must have met hundreds of them, how do they reflect on their service? Would they have preferred to have been anywhere else in the US Navy than on the LCIs?
Yes. Yes to all of that. Yes, and yes. So they were all very proud of their service. But the best parts of their stories when they reflect are how much they hated their ships initially, but then they slowly learned to love their ships. Some of them. My grandpa still, to the very end, he hated LCIs. But most of them, funny enough, they really did. It was tough. It was a struggle every single day. But the best part of interviewing some of these guys is the stories that they tell of them and their buddies, the trouble they would get into on the ship, the things they would do when they weren't in battle, like just to kill the time, because boredom was a huge problem when there's nothing else to, when you're not in battle. So on an LCI, small space, there's not much to do. You got to find ways to make do and kill time. And some of the best stories of these guys when they reflect on it is the fun stories that they had with each other. And I think my favorite story from my grandpa's is the beer stealing story. Now, as I mentioned earlier,
tell us where he gets busted, doesn't he?
He does. Yes, that's probably my favorite. That was, I think, my whole family's favorite sea story that he had was the beer stealing story. So how that all started was how we alluded to earlier, that they didn't get the basic necessities. They were allotted beer, 2 cans, maybe a month or something, but very rarely did they even ever get that. So when they were converted to a gunboat, the LCI L65, the name changed to the LCI G65. No, it's not really that big of a deal. Usually, traditionally in the Navy, if you get a different name or something changes in the name, usually it's the tradition to toast, make a toast to the new name for luck, for good fortune type thing. And they didn't get their beer allotment. They went to the supply and they refused to give them their beer. And they're like, absolutely not. Unacceptable. We have to figure out a way to get this beer. And they would not give it to them. This was at a time where they were doing patrols all the time. So they thought after repairs, they were at Florida Island at the time, right across from Guadalcanal. And they figured they were going to be right back in the action after they got done being repaired. So the last thing that they did before taking off from the dry dock was they stole 15 cases of beer. And they had an elaborate way to hide it in the bosun locker in the front of the ship. But unfortunately, they got busted because they didn't go off to war. They just basically sat there anchored for a few days outside of the dry dock. And sooner or later, the chief came aboard because according to inventory, 15 cases are gone and they're unaccounted for. And the only likely suspects are these guys on the LCI 65 out there. So go get them. They have to have it. So the chief comes aboard and they inspect the whole ship and they find it up stashed in the bosun locker in the front there. And there was a whole team of them that acted as lookouts and the team that went to go steal it and extract the beer and bring it back. And then the bosun to hide it. So there was a whole conspiracy to steal this beer. And unfortunately, the guy that got caught with it, this guy, Paul DeWitt, a good friend of my grandpa, he already had so many strikes against him when it came to getting in trouble. This is like the guy's 4th offense or 5th offense already. And they were like, if you take the rap for this, you're going to get kicked out of the Navy with a dishonorable discharge. So my grandpa took the fall for everything and he volunteered because he had a clean record. So he was like, okay, I don't want to see my buddy get kicked out of the Navy. So what's the big deal? I'll take the hit. So him and his buddy, Stuart Oberson, they got hit with a court martial, a captain's mast, and they got demoted temporarily. But it was just the story of them, how they stole the beer was just, every Christmas and Thanksgiving when he was alive, when he would tell that story, it was just the whole family would erupt in laughter. It was so great.
It conjures up that idea that with these vessels, they have presumably quite a lot of freedom, as opposed to if you're a seaman on some of the larger ocean-going vessels, for weeks and months at a time, your life becomes very regimented. Whereas these guys, presumably, it's all about short hops. So they'll be in base, trying to scrounge up what they need, waiting, then it'll be quickly go here, do something, hang about somewhere else. There's this weird nomadic lifestyle that they must have sort of led, and slightly almost like pirates turning up, getting what they need, moving on, doing something, repeat.
That's a great way to put it. And that's a very unique aspect of life on an LCI. They're an LCI sailors. Yeah. When you're on an aircraft carrier, it's spit and polish. Everything has a place and everything in its place. Your uniform of the day is spit and polished and ironed and pressed. Whereas they didn't really have a uniform on in the day, or uniform of the day on LCIs. They didn't really go through any inspections. It was a waste of time. Like who cares? So it's like their uniform of the day was usually pants that have been cut off and no shirt. And so maybe some shoes that like the tips, like the boot type has been cut to make them into sandals because it's so hot in the Pacific. But other than that, yeah, you're right. That's a great way to put a very carefree, sometimes lifestyle when it comes to naval regulation. They were unique where no one's really busting their chops about, not wearing the uniform of the day.
I can almost see some guys reflecting on it going, actually, we quite enjoyed it. And then there's some guys like your grandfather who saw a tremendous amount of action going, it was bloody awful. But some people who did much more of the logistical ship to shore, or not even ship to shore, just moving stuff ashore, be a very different experience quite free, which was a very different experience. Good stuff. I can't help but think there's a great, almost like MASH TV series there to be made.
That's what I'm hoping. And I'll leave you with this because that's another thing I made a note of. So when you talked to Paul Woodage not too long ago about the D-Day tours, there was a part of the podcast where he brought up a really good point, which is kind of piggybacking off your point that these really deserve to be in cinema. They really need to be portrayed in movies or TV shows, because he brought up a great point that 30 years ago, everybody that toured, Omaha Beach D-Day, they talk about Stephen Ambrose. He'd be the talk of the town. You wouldn't have a tour go by without bringing up Ambrose. And it's like, now look at it, it's 2024. Nobody brings up Stephen Ambrose anymore, even though he's the guy he is basically the historian of Normandy, and he wrote Band of Brothers, and that show was made that was adapted from his book. And it's like, but that's kind of goes to show that's what happens over time is, people can forget books, but when you make something memorable like a movie, that's why it's so important. I think it's really important to adapt this story, to tell the LCI story, because these guys, they're guys that deserve to be remembered, and their stories that deserve to be told. And they've earned their 15 minutes of fame that they haven't got yet. So I think listening to that just made me think it's like all the more reason they need to be portrayed in cinema.
You need an LCI moment in something like the Pacific, don't you? I suspect a lot of people hadn't heard of the Higgins Boats until Band of Brothers sort of really... I'm trying to go back through the Pacific now, and I can't... Do they make any assault landings? That's not really part of the bigger narrative, is it?
They do.
But they're in Amtrak's, aren't they?
They're in Amtrak's, yes. So their abbreviation LVTs, so landing vehicle tracked. So LVTs were the little Amtrak, like it's Amtrak comes from the abbreviation amphibious tractor, like an amphibious tracked vehicle. So they abbreviated Amtrak, but they did portray the Amtraks in the Pacific, which I think is great. But unfortunately, they only gave LSTs. There's only, I think, like it's a 1.5 seconds or a 2-second frame where it just shows the Amtrak slowly coming out of the bow of the LST. And then that's it. And then they don't show LSTs again after that. And it's like, it's great that Higgins Boats and Amtraks get their 15 minutes of fame. It's well deserved, but it's like there's so many other amphibious force ships that deserve to have their stories told too.
Yeah, indeed they do. Good stuff. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Zach. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about LCIs, Zach's book is When the Beaches Trembled, the incredible true story of Stephen Ganzberger and the LCIs in World War II. So that is all for this episode. Don't forget, if you regularly enjoy the show, why not sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.